Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 75 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Minnesota Wild, in which the Sharks have lost 5-4 in overtime. So we have officially reached double digits on this losing streak for the Sharks, 10 losses in a row. However, it is not necessarily as bad as it sounds. Many of these last few Sharks losses, at the very least, have been in overtime. Here tonight against the Wild, a couple nights ago against the Blackhawks, a couple nights before that against the Nashville Predators, and many of their losses have been by just a single goal. And so I feel as though with a bit better luck, the Sharks probably could have won at least a couple of these last 10 games. That's not necessarily that much better, going 2-8 or 3-7 in the last 10 games is not particularly good, but just to say that this hasn't just been the Sharks getting absolutely demolished game in and game out over their last 10 games, to at the very least look at this with some glass half full situation. And that was exactly the case here tonight against the Wild. The Sharks played an okay game. It wasn't amazing. They didn't dominate the Wild, but on the other hand, they didn't get dominated by the Minnesota Wild either. And it should be noted that the Wild, unlike, let's say, the Blackhawks, who the Sharks lost to 5-4 in the shootout just a few days ago, unlike the Blackhawks, the Wild are an extremely good team. Maybe not right up there with the likes of the Florida Panthers and the Colorado Avalanche, but a potential dark horse to make something happen in the playoffs this year. If they can get past the first round of the St. Louis Blues, you never know what could happen with Minnesota. Very strong team, over 100 points now, and so it's not as though this was an easy matchup for the Sharks, but they played certainly well enough to get the win. It just didn't end up happening. This one started off with a Wild goal. That would be Kulikov, one that Reimer would likely want back, as this one is actually a sort of giveaway from Thomas Bordeleau making his debut with the San Jose Sharks here tonight. He rims this one up the boards trying to find Balcers, but it's a bit too hard of a rim. Balcers is unable to reach it. It comes to Kulikov, but of course this probably shouldn't be a goal in general if not for a misplay by James Reimer. Eventually the Wild would make it 2-0 for themselves, and it looked like that this game might just start to get away from the San Jose Sharks, but they actually brought it to within one off of a Rudolf Balcers goal, very similar to the one scored by Kulikov, a pretty weak goal by Fleury, but this Balcers goal also featured the first NHL point of Thomas Bordeleau. Made a nice play behind the net to take it away from the Wild defender, passed it up to Balcers, who managed to get that goal. So early in the first period, or I guess, at a point in the first period, Bordeleau managed to get his first career point, and it's an assist. Into the second period, the Sharks would manage to tie the game relatively early on, as Matt Nieto would score to make it 2-2. The Wild would then get the lead back 3-2, but the Sharks would tie it once more with yet another goal, that one coming from Noah Gregor. Bordeleau would be on the ice for this goal, but he would actually be the fourth player to touch the puck, so he doesn't get the secondary assist. Would have had the tertiary assist if that were to exist, but of course it does not. But in the end, the game is tied at 3 and we head into the third period. The Sharks looked significantly better in the second period than they did in the first. In fact, they were the much better team in that middle frame, and so it was a question of which team would come out looking better in the third period, and that's kind of been a situation that the Sharks have been in over these past few games, going into the third period, behind a goal or maybe just generally tied. And the Sharks managed to win that one period against the Blackhawks, but they didn't win the period here tonight. The Wild seemed just that much faster and better than the Sharks, which I guess isn't that much of a surprise considering their standings position. The Sharks would get their first lead of the game with a Nick Bonino shorthanded goal, but eventually on a relatively controversial goal, I guess you could say, Fiala would score. He runs into the glove of James Reimer. Reimer was not happy that this goal ended up standing, but the Sharks did not challenge. Obviously, would have been a very risky move to challenge in that situation, because if you do get it wrong, you give the Wild a power play in a 4-4 game with just a few minutes left in the third period. You don't really want to do that, and so they don't end up challenging it. I'm sure Reimer's not going to be particularly happy with that, but it's a 4-4 game, and we head into overtime, where the Sharks have struggled just immensely as of late. They started the season so well in the sort of 5-minute 3-on-3 play, but it seems as though they've lost all their skill in that particular part. It is all Wild for the entirety of the overtime, which only actually lasts about a minute before it is a shot from Fiala tipped in by Spurgeon to give the Wild the victory. On to the players to talk about. We have the first line of Meier, Hertl, and Dahlin, and surprise, surprise, actually not a sarcastic surprise, this was one of the worst lines for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. It just couldn't get anything rolling, generally seemed very frustrated. Meier in particular seemed extremely frustrated here tonight, ended up punching a player in the face, I believe, near the end of the beginning of the third or maybe the end of the second period, and took a penalty there, then just absolutely leveled Hartman for no reason in the middle of the ice on a very easy interference call late in the third period. And generally this first line just didn't really get anything rolling, which is not necessarily a terrible thing when it comes to Meier and Hertl, but it is probably not a great look for Dahlin, who's hoping to try and keep this spot on the top line because it is relatively precarious, even though the Sharks don't necessarily have someone who's just ready to fill in that particular spot. Dahlin, if you're going to have games where you suddenly make the Hertl-Meier line not look good, not to say that was his fault here tonight, you're not necessarily going to be able to keep that spot. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, and I'm doing, Couture a service here calling this the second line, considering the players he's with, we have Couture, Bonino, and Nieto, which, surprise, surprise, also not in the sarcastic sense, was a good line for the Sharks here tonight. I definitely was not expecting that to be the case. I thought this was going to be a line similar to how it was just yesterday against the Stars, which just didn't really do much of anything, but actually they had some decent offensive zone time. Obviously Nieto did score a goal, Bonino also scored, though that was on shorthanded, not at even strength, and I thought this line was actually pretty decent. It wasn't amazing, it didn't blow me away, but it was certainly above expectations, which is nice to see for a second line that, like I said, is barely even a second line and features two players who would probably be lucky to find themselves on a fourth line on an actual competitive team and not the San Jose Sharks. When it comes to the third line, this was obviously the most interesting line of the game coming in here for the Sharks, considering they are not in the playoffs, so you're just kind of looking for things to be excited about, and you did not have to look much further than the third line center position here, Thomas Bordeleau, and I was very excited to see him playing with these two players, because if he wasn't going to play the wing, these were the two players who I wanted him to be flanked with, Balcers and Gregor. Luckily, Booner decided to not play him with some, VL and Shemek or whatever, even though I believe those two players were injured for here tonight. And this third line was probably the most enigmatic offensive line for the San Jose Sharks. I'd say the most balanced was probably still the second line with Logan Couture, but this one seemed to be getting the most chances. They scored 2 of the Sharks' goals, which is half of them, and 2/3 of them that were at even strength. That came from both Gregor and Balcers, and generally I thought this line generated a lot of chances. And to focus more on Bordeleau, I thought at the start of this game in the first period, he seemed a bit overwhelmed with the amount of speed that's at the NHL level. Obviously, the massive jump, not only from the NCAA, but even from the AHL to the NHL level, it is indeed a massive jump. Just the style of play is extremely different, especially since you're jumping into a game against such a strong team like the Minnesota Wild. It took a moment for Bordeleau to adjust, but he ended up making some nice plays, got some good chances. He had a couple of 2-on-1s. One of them he tried to make the pass when he probably should have shot. A second time he did actually end up shooting, which was nice to see, even if it didn't end up going in. Like I said earlier as well, he did get his first career point as an assist on the Balcers goal. And so while on the defensive side there was a bit of floating around, he seemed slightly lost in the defensive zone at times, where things were just kind of moving a bit too fast around him, and he did find himself on the ice for a couple of goals against. I thought it was generally a solid debut for Bordeleau at the NHL level, and like I said, this was probably the Sharks' most offensively strong line of the night, which was nice to see. When it comes to the fourth line of Weatherby, Shemilevsky, and Reedy, I thought this fourth line was decent, kind of like how they were in the previous game, not necessarily generating a ton, I would say, but they did have, I believe, one very good chance earlier on in this game. I thought it was an okay enough performance tonight. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we yet again had a player step out of the lineup. That would be Megna, who had been very good for the Sharks as of late, so we'd see who would be able to fill in that spot. And the Sharks actually decided to load up on the first pairings, reuniting both Burns and Ferraro there, and then leaving the other two pairings to sort of fend for themselves, I guess you could say. So the Ferraro-Burns pairing I thought was actually rather impressive. Nice to see Ferraro step up a bit after I guess you could say say I called him out in the previous game. Burns, I thought, was also pretty good here tonight, especially when you consider they got heavy ice time against some very, very good players, in particular Kirill Kaprizov of the Minnesota Wild. When it comes to the other two pairings, we had a second pairing, I guess you could say a second pairing. I believe it was Milosh and Merkley. I thought both of these players were okay at times, nothing super amazing from them. Merkley had a couple of very nice looks offensively, a couple of very nice maneuvers, I guess you could say. But on the defensive side of things, also sort of like the same criticism I levied towards Bordelot, was a bit floaty at times. When it comes to Milosh, like I mentioned, it's nice that he is paired with Merkley in this situation, but he also got a lot of shifts with players like Vlasic as well, which did obviously expose his lack of puck moving capabilities, so he did find himself in the defensive zone a lot. The other player who I do want to mention is Santeri Hatakka, who is essentially the 9th defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, but because the Sharks are dealing with so many injuries right now, he actually manages to find a way into the lineup. I thought he also played an okay enough game, wasn't completely exposed, which was nice to see. And finally was the goaltender James Reimer in the nets tonight, and it was not so great of a game for Reimer. You can't blame him on many of the goals, but definitely this first one, like I mentioned earlier, by Kulikov was one that Reimer definitely should have had. The second Wild goal, I believe, was tipped in. The overtime winner was also tipped in. The Fiala goal was one that Reimer believed he was interfered with, and so you could argue whether or not that would actually be his fault or not. And so generally it was an okay night for Reimer, but nothing amazing, and maybe with slightly better goaltending the Sharks could have indeed ended up winning this game, but things just can't all seem to fall into place in just one particular game for the Sharks as of late, which is why they have lost those 10 straight games. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, and we'll see if they can finally get a victory then. Class dismissed.